The first drops of rain struck the red earth like bullets, each one a harbinger of the deluge to come. Ember, a young bandicoot with rust-colored fur and keen black eyes, lifted her snout to the darkening sky. The scent carried more than moisture. It brought the acrid smell of smoke from the north, where lightning had struck dry eucalyptus groves 3 days prior. She had been foraging near the creek bed when the wind shifted, carrying with it the unmistakable roar of approaching wildfire. Her powerful hind legs, built for digging and quick escapes, tensed as she calculated distances. The fire was moving fast, pushed by fierce winds that bent the grass in waves like a golden ocean. Ember's burrow lay 200 meters away, but between her and safety stretched an open meadow dotted with fallen logs and sparse shrubs. No cover, no protection. The flames crested the hill behind her with a sound like a freight train, consuming everything in their path. She bolted. Her claws found purchase on the hard-packed earth as she zigzagged between obstacles, her pointed snout cutting through the thickening smoke. Behind her, the fire roared closer, its heat pressing against her back like a giant's breath. Sparks rained down around her, singeing the tips of her ears. Halfway across the meadow, disaster struck. Her right hind paw caught in a rabbit hole, sending her tumbling across the ground. Pain shot up her leg as she tried to stand. The ankle was twisted, possibly sprained. The fire was less than 50 meters away now, a wall of orange death that devoured everything in its path. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but Ember forced herself to think. Bandicoots were survivors. Her species had endured ice ages, droughts, and countless predators. She would not become ash today. Limping badly, she changed course toward a rocky outcropping she'd noticed earlier. If she could reach the stones, she might find a crevice deep enough to shelter in while the fire passed overhead. The rocks were closer than her burrow, but still 30 meters away through increasingly thick smoke. Each hop sent agony through her injured leg, but she pressed on. The heat was becoming unbearable now, and she could hear the fire consuming the grass behind her with hungry crackles. Embers landed on her fur, and she rolled quickly to extinguish them, losing precious seconds. 20 meters, 15, 10. The rocks loomed ahead, dark granite worn smooth by countless seasons. Ember could see a narrow gap between two large boulders, barely wide enough for her compact body. She dove for it just as the fire reached the meadow's edge. The crevice was deeper than she'd hoped, extending back into the rock formation like a natural tunnel. She squeezed herself as far back as possible, pressing her body against the cool stone. Outside, the world became a furnace. The fire passed over her hiding place with the fury of a living thing. Through the narrow opening, she watched flames leap 20 feet into the air, consuming everything combustible in seconds. The heat was intense even in her stone shelter, and she panted heavily, her tongue lolling out as she tried to cool herself. For what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the inferno raged overhead. Then, gradually, the roar began to fade. The flames moved on, leaving behind a landscape transformed into charcoal and ash. Ember waited until the sounds completely died away before venturing out. The world she emerged into was alien. Black earth stretched in every direction, punctuated by the skeletal remains of trees. The air was thick with ash and the acrid smell of burned vegetation. Her meadow, her foraging grounds, her entire territory had been erased. But she was alive. Her injured paw throbbed with each step, but she could put weight on it. Nothing was broken. She began the careful journey back toward where her burrow had been, though she held little hope of finding it intact. The landscape was treacherous now. The fire had burned away all the familiar landmarks, and hidden beneath the ash were hot spots that could burn her paws. She picked her way carefully, testing each step. Where her burrow should have been, she found only a shallow depression filled with ash. Everything was gone. Her food stores, her carefully constructed tunnels, her safe haven. For a moment, despair threatened to overwhelm her. How could she survive in this wasteland? Then she heard it, a faint chirping sound coming from a partially burned log nearby. Investigating carefully, she discovered a clutch of beetle larvae that had survived in the log's hollow center. Food. Not much, but enough to sustain her while she figured out her next move. As she ate, Ember's sharp mind began working on the problem of survival. The fire had destroyed her territory, but it had also created opportunities. Burned areas often attracted insects and small creatures seeking shelter in the remaining debris. And with the vegetation gone, digging would be easier in the soft ash. She spent the rest of the day exploring her transformed territory, mapping the new landscape in her mind. Near the creek, which had survived as a thin trickle between blackened banks, she found a cluster of rocks that had been exposed by the fire, perfect for a temporary shelter. Using her powerful claws, she began excavating a new burrow beneath the largest rock. The work was exhausting with her injured paw, but she persevered. By nightfall, she had created a shallow tunnel just deep enough to protect her from predators and the elements. The next morning brought new challenges. Rain began falling, the same storm system that had threatened the day before finally arriving. In normal circumstances, rain would be welcome, but now it turned the ash into a slippery, treacherous mud that made travel difficult and foraging nearly impossible. Ember huddled in her makeshift burrow as the rain pounded down, washing away the loose ash and revealing the true extent of the fire's damage. When it finally stopped, she emerged to find small green shoots already beginning to push through the blackened earth. Life was returning, but it would be weeks before there was enough vegetation to support the insects and grubs she depended on. She needed to find a more permanent solution. Over the following days, Ember expanded her territory, venturing farther from her temporary shelter than she ever had before. The fire had created a patchwork landscape, some areas completely devastated, others barely touched. In these green islands, she found enough food to survive, but competition was fierce. Other animals had been displaced by the fire, and everyone was struggling for the same limited resources. On the fourth day, she encountered another Bandicoot, an older male named Flint who had lost his territory on the other side of the burned zone. Normally, Bandicoots were solitary creatures, but desperate times called for cooperation. They formed an uneasy alliance, sharing information about food sources and safe routes through the dangerous terrain. Flint had discovered something remarkable. A section of the creek where the fire had burned so hot that it had exposed a clay bank filled with earthworms and beetle larvae. The rich deposit could sustain them both while they rebuilt their lives, but it was located in the territory of a family of Ghanas who had also survived the fire. The monitor lizards were formidable predators, each one capable of swallowing a bandicoot whole. But they were also creatures of habit, and Ember had observed their patterns during her scouting missions. They hunted primarily during the heat of the day, retreating to their rocky dens during the cooler morning and evening hours. Working together, Ember and Flint developed a strategy. They would take turns keeping watch while the other foraged, and they would only approach the clay bank during the Ghana's inactive periods. It was risky, but it was their best chance for long-term survival. Bandicoot had dared hope. For 3 weeks, they successfully raided the clay bank during the early morning hours, building up their strength and energy reserves. Ember's injured paw healed completely, and both animals began to put on the weight they'd lost during the initial crisis. But their success attracted unwanted attention. One morning, as Ember kept watch while Flint dug for larvae, she spotted movement in the rocks above the creek. A large female goanna had emerged earlier than usual, her forked tongue flicking out to taste the air. She detected their scent. Ember chirped a warning, and both bandicoots froze. The monitor lizard was between them and their escape route, her powerful body coiled and ready to strike. For a long moment, predator and prey stared at each other across the burned landscape. Then Flint did something unexpected. Instead of fleeing, he began digging frantically in the clay bank, sending chunks of earth flying in all directions. The goanna, startled by the sudden movement and shower of debris, hesitated just long enough for Ember to understand his plan. She joined him, and together they created such a cloud of dust and flying mud that the lizard lost sight of them entirely. In the confusion, they slipped away through a gap in the rocks that was too narrow for their pursuer to follow. The close call taught them an important lesson. They needed to find a more permanent solution. The temporary alliance had served its purpose, but winter was approaching, and they would both need secure territories with reliable food sources. Over the next few days, they explored the edges of the burned zone, looking for areas where recovery was most advanced. Ember discovered something that made her heart race with excitement. A section of unburned forest that had been protected by a rocky ridge. The fire had jumped over it entirely, leaving a small oasis of green in the sea of black. The area was already occupied by other survivors, but there was enough space for one more burrow if she was clever about placement. More importantly, the established ecosystem meant abundant food and natural shelter. Flint chose a different path, deciding to head south toward a river valley where other bandicoots had reportedly gathered. They parted ways with mutual respect, their unlikely partnership having saved both their lives. Ember spent 2 days carefully observing the green sanctuary before making her move. She identified the perfect spot, a gentle slope near a small spring, protected by overhanging rocks and surrounded by the kind of dense undergrowth that attracted the insects she preferred. The digging took her nearly a week. She worked mostly at night, when the other residents were less likely to notice her activities. Her new burrow was more sophisticated than her old one, with multiple entrances and a complex tunnel system that would provide escape routes if predators discovered her location. As autumn progressed into winter, Ember watched her burned territory slowly come back to life. Green shoots pushed through the ash, insects returned to feed on the new growth, and gradually other animals began to venture back into the recovering landscape. She made occasional trips to her old territory, partly from nostalgia and partly to monitor its recovery. On one such visit, she was amazed to discover that her original burrow site had become a small wetland. The fire had altered the drainage patterns, and winter rains had collected in the depression, creating a perfect habitat for frogs and water insects. By spring, Ember had not only survived the fire but had thrived in its aftermath. Her new territory was larger and more diverse than her original home, and she had learned skills that would serve her well for the rest of her life. She had discovered that she was capable of far more than she had ever imagined. The fire that had seemed like the end of everything had actually been a beginning. It had forced her to grow, to adapt, to become stronger and more resourceful. As she sat outside her burrow one warm evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange that no longer reminded her of flames but of hope, Ember understood that survival wasn't just about enduring disaster. It was about finding ways to flourish in spite of it. In the distance, she could hear the calls of other bandicoots who had also made new homes in the recovering landscape. The fire had scattered them, but it had also taught them all the same valuable lesson. that life finds a way, and that sometimes the greatest challenges lead to the greatest opportunities for growth. Ember settled into her burrow for the night, content in the knowledge that she had not merely survived, she had conquered. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove that a small bandicoot with determination and courage could overcome anything the world threw at her. The burned landscape around her continued its slow transformation back to green, and with each passing day, it became not a reminder of destruction, but a testament to the incredible resilience of life itself.